My evil mother-in-law kicked me out of my own apartment for showing up with my kids at her birthday party. I told you I don't want those brats here. They destroy everything, she yelled at me. But I firmly refused, and minutes later, if you weren't here, my son would be happy. Violetta felt the air grow thick in her own home. Margaret's words hung in the dining room with the same ease as if they were talking about the weather. But this wasn't casual talk. It was a declaration of war. In front of her, her mother-in-law looked at her with a perfectly calculated expression, her lips curled into a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Across the table, Bruno avoided looking at either of them, pretending to be too busy cutting the meat on his plate. The twins, Misha and Dima, were focused on their food, unaware of the suffocating tension filling the room. At their age, they didn't understand the depth of the words, but they understood the weight of silence. Did you notice, son? Since Violetta came into your life, you've only had problems, Margaret continued, sipping her wine as if savoring her victory. You don't rest, you're always tired, always angry. This is not the life I imagined for you. Violetta's hand trembled over her fork. Every meal with Margaret was a minefield. No matter what she did, she always found a way to turn every occasion into a power display. Maybe if you rested a bit, took some time away from all this stress, Margaret's voice slid with venomous sweetness. You could stay at my place for a few days. Bruno didn't answer immediately, and that silence was worse than any word. Violetta felt a sharp pain in her chest. She had hoped her husband would laugh, deny it, tell his mother to stop being ridiculous. But Bruno just kept eating, as if the conversation didn't matter. I'm fine, Mom, he said finally, without looking up from his plate. Margaret smiled indulgently. Of course, dear, of course. You always say that. The air froze in the room. Violetta knew at that moment that something was breaking irreparably. After dinner, while she was washing the dishes in the kitchen, she heard footsteps behind her. She expected to feel Bruno's arms around her waist, maybe a whispered, "Don't pay attention to her," in her ear. But all she heard was his voice, distant, almost indifferent. You don't have to react like this. You know how my mom is. The plate she was holding nearly slipped from her hands. React like this? She repeated, slowly turning around. Bruno leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. She didn't mean it seriously. She just worries about me. Violetta looked at him in disbelief. She said that if I weren't here, you'd be happy, and suggested you move in with her. Bruno sighed. I didn't mean she didn't say it seriously. It's just, she thinks like that. But we can't let it affect us. Violetta felt the anger swirling in her chest. We? Her voice trembled. Or just me? Bruno looked away. Just, don't make this bigger than it is, okay? Violetta felt the rage tightening her chest. It wasn't about what Margaret said, but about what Bruno didn't do. He wasn't defending her. He wasn't choosing her. He stayed silent. And that silence said it all. Later, lying in bed, she heard Bruno's voice in the living room. She held her breath, straining her senses to catch every word. Mom, I really don't know what to do. Violetta's heart stopped. Margaret's voice in a near whisper responded. I know, son. You have to make a decision. You can't keep living like this. Violetta pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cold of betrayal run down her back. I don't want to hurt her, murmured Bruno. There was a short silence. Sometimes, to be happy, you have to make tough decisions, replied Margaret. An unfathomable emptiness opened in Violetta's chest. Bruno was considering leaving her. She returned to the room without making a sound. She slipped under the sheets and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't her home. Her home had ceased to be her home the moment Bruno allowed someone else to decide about their marriage. Sleep didn't come that night. Only the certainty that she was completely alone. Violetta stared at the ceiling without blinking. The weight of betrayal kept her motionless, as if her own body refused to accept what it had heard. Bruno didn't love her enough to defend her. Bruno didn't have the courage to tell her the truth to her face. Bruno wasn't her ally. He was a silent bystander while her mother ate away at their marriage from within. The air in the room felt heavy, dense, as if the whole space had been filled with an unbearable void. She closed her eyes, but the phrase kept repeating in her mind. You need to make a decision. You can't keep living like this. Bruno had stayed silent. That meant the idea didn't seem absurd to him. Morning came without Violetta having slept. She heard Bruno moving around the house, the shower turning on, the hurried steps of the twins running down the hall. She got up mechanically, made breakfast without saying a word, and when Bruno tried to kiss her on the cheek before leaving, she turned her face away. He said nothing, simply grabbed his briefcase and left. He didn't even ask if she was okay. He didn't even notice the shadow of the previous night on her face. Just an hour after Bruno left, the phone rang. Violetta looked at the screen with the same indifference as one looks at a knife on the table. Margaret's name blinked on the screen. She let it ring until the pre-recorded voice of the voicemail filled the house with a sharp, cold tone. A voicemail notification appeared. Against her better judgment, she played it. Good morning, darling. Margaret's voice sounded radiant, almost enthusiastic. I spoke with Bruno and he told me you still haven't responded about my birthday. Don't worry, I've already decided for you. The celebration will be at your house. It doesn't make sense to spend money on a restaurant when you have enough space. Plus, your home needs a touch of life. It will be good for everyone. Don't worry about the organization. Bruno and I will take care of it. Just make sure you don't ruin it. The message ended with a sharp click. The phone nearly slipped from her hands. Margaret had made the decision. As always. As though she didn't matter at all. She bit her lip hard, feeling the burn on her skin. She took a deep breath and forced herself to think clearly. There was no way she could accept this. Margaret wasn't going to turn her house into a stage for her show. She picked up the phone and dialed Bruno's number. She knew him too well to think he wasn't already aware of the decision. It rang several times before her husband answered in his usual tone, as if nothing were wrong. Hi, love. Tell me this is a joke. Bruno went silent. Margaret left a message on my voicemail. She said her birthday is going to be at our house. Tell me you didn't accept. Bruno sighed, and that one sound was enough to confirm it. I couldn't say no to her. It's her birthday. She doesn't have anywhere else. Violetta felt a strange coldness run through her body. And me? Don't I have a right to decide what happens in my own house? It's just one night. It's not about one night, Bruno. It's about the fact that she does whatever she wants and you let her. Bruno stayed silent. Sit down and talk to her when you get home. Violetta hung up. She had no intention of talking to anyone. The days leading up to the celebration were marked by tense silence in the house. Violetta avoided any conversation about the matter, and Bruno pretended everything was fine. The house felt bigger than usual, as if the walls themselves knew something was about to break. On the morning of the birthday, while Violetta tried to keep her routine with the kids, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting visitors. When she opened the door, her stomach tightened. Margaret stood in the doorway, wearing an elegant dark blue dress and carrying a wheeled suitcase beside her. Good morning, dear, she said with a smile, pushing the door and entering without being invited. I decided to come early to help you with the preparations. Violetta watched her in silence. I don't need help. Margaret ignored the response and moved through the house with the confidence of someone who feels everything belongs to her. My goodness, this place needs some festive decorations. Don't worry, I brought a few things. Violetta clenched her fists. Bruno organized everything. Bruno did what he could, but there are still many details left. And, dear, you have plenty of other things to think about. The way she said it made Violetta tense up. Margaret stopped near one of the shelves. She ran her fingers along the wood and, with a calculated move, pulled out a small wooden box that Violetta had kept on the top shelf. I didn't know you had this. Violetta felt a jolt of alarm. Leave it there. Margaret smiled and, leisurely, ran her fingers over the lid before opening it. Inside were a series of documents, old letters, and some black and white photos. How curious, Margaret murmured. You don't seem like the type of woman who keeps secrets. Violetta lunged for the box, but Margaret closed it before she could grab it. Don't worry, dear. I'm just curious. What's inside? None of your business. Margaret's eyes gleamed with a spark of malice. It's always interesting to know more about the woman who has captured my son's heart. Violetta felt a chill. Margaret had seen something, and even if she didn't say it, she would remember. The afternoon passed with a sense of veiled threat. The house filled with preparations for the party. Margaret gave orders as if it were her own home. She rearranged things, replaced the flowers Violetta had chosen with more elegant ones, and scrutinized every detail with a critical eye. As the guests arrived, Violetta began to notice something odd. As she walked through the room, some people looked at her with expressions that were a mix of sympathy and distance. It was as though someone had said something about her. Margaret moved around the house with the confidence of a queen. Her laughter echoed, her presence filled the entire space. When Violetta returned from putting the kids in their room, she found Margaret in the middle of the living room with a glass in hand, surrounded by the guests. Her voice, overly sweet, immediately caught Violetta's attention. Sometimes there are people who enter our lives and change them in unexpected ways, Margaret said, her gaze fixed on Violetta. And sometimes there are people who arrive with secrets. Whispers spread among the guests. Violetta felt her heart race. What do you mean by that? Margaret took a sip of her drink and smiled. I'm just saying that you never really finish getting to know people. The silence in the room became heavy, uncomfortable. I don't understand what you're implying, Violetta said, her voice tight. Margaret looked at her with feigned surprise. Oh, dear, I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying that trust is a fragile thing. Violetta felt her skin burning. If you have something to say it. Margaret looked at her as if she were a spoiled child. This is my celebration, dear. Don't ruin the moment. The air became suffocating. Violetta knew in that instant that this was not just a birthday. It was a siege, and Margaret intended to win it. Violetta decided to go upstairs to check on her twins. From there, she could hear the muffled murmur of the party through the closed door. Her children, Misha and Dima, were sitting on the bed, hugging their pillows, their faces full of worry. They knew something wasn't right, although they still didn't understand why their mother had locked herself in with them while their house was filling up with people. The sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and unfamiliar voices filtered through the wood. The feeling of being trapped, of being a stranger in her own house, made Violetta's skin crawl. She had given up too much. She had allowed Margaret to take her space, her peace, her family. And now she was reduced to hiding in a room with her children while the others celebrated. She couldn't go on like this. She stood up, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her body. Her children looked at her uncertainly. Mom, what's happening? Dima asked in a low voice. Let's go, Violetta said, taking their hands. We don't have to hide. The children exchanged a nervous glance, but obeyed. Together, they crossed the door and entered the living room. The atmosphere changed immediately. At first, the murmurs and music continued, but as soon as the first guests noticed their presence, the noise slowly quieted down until only the distant echo of the background music remained. People looked at them with a mix of surprise and pity. It was a heavy, oppressive feeling, as if she had become an intruder in her own house. Violetta scanned the room. She recognized some of Bruno's relatives, old colleagues of Margaret, neighbors who rarely visited. They were all enjoying the evening without worrying that the true hostess of the house was absent. Her stomach twisted when she realized that, in fact, she was not part of this scene. And then, Margaret appeared at the center of the room. Violetta, she said, with a voice so artificially sweet that it sounded poisonous. What a surprise to see you out of your room. The silence in the room grew heavier. Violetta felt the eyes piercing her like tiny needles. No one was defending her. No one was greeting her. No one saw her as the owner of the house. Only Margaret. Only Margaret with her sharp smile and calculating gaze. I told you everything would be fine without you, Margaret continued, her tone turning firmer. What are you doing here? Violetta straightened her back, still holding onto her children's hands. This is my house, she replied clearly. Margaret let out a dry, cruel laugh. Your house? Don't fool yourself, dear. This house isn't yours. Without Bruno, you'd have nothing. Violetta felt the heat of anger rise in her throat. This place is as much mine as it is Bruno's. And I'm not a guest. Margaret clicked her tongue and crossed her arms. Listen carefully, Violetta. I don't want you to ruin the celebration. You have two options. You can go back to your room like you've done all night, or you can leave with your children. Violetta felt Misha squeeze her hand tightly. Mom, whispered the boy, scared. Dima, who had always been more impetuous, glared at his grandmother with a childish look of anger, but Violetta gestured for him to stay silent. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. The one who shouldn't be here is you. A murmur of surprise spread through the room. No one expected her to defend herself. No one expected her to rebel. But Margaret wasn't used to losing. What did you say? Violetta let go of her children's hands and took a step forward. I said this is my house. And if someone doesn't like it, they can leave through the door. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret looked at her with fury. You're ungrateful. I'm a woman tired of being treated as if I don't exist. The tension was unbearable. The moment when everything would explode was about to arrive. Then, Bruno intervened. Enough, he said in a tired tone. Violetta turned to look at him. Bruno looked at her with pleading eyes, but without conviction. Let's not make this bigger. Margaret just wants to celebrate her birthday. In my house. Kicking me out of my own living room. Bruno ran a hand over his face. Maybe it's better if you take the kids and go to Natasha's house for the night. You can come back tomorrow. The words hit Violetta like a punch in the stomach. Is that what you want? Bruno didn't answer right away. He looked at his mother, then at the guests, then at Violetta. I just want to avoid more problems. Violetta felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. The betrayal was complete. Bruno didn't defend her. He didn't protect her. He didn't choose her. Violetta felt anger replacing the pain. Fine, her voice was cold. If that's what you want, I'll give it to you. But not how he thought. She turned to the guests. The party is over. Everyone needs to leave. The murmuring grew in the room. Violetta, Bruno tried to speak, but she ignored him. This is my house, she said firmly. And I decide who stays and who leaves. The guests began to move awkwardly. No one wanted to stay in the middle of a marital conflict. Some grabbed their coats, others murmured excuses. Margaret still didn't accept it. You don't have the right to do this. Yes, I do. Because this house is mine. Bruno stepped forward, but Violetta raised her hand. If you defend your mother in this, it will be the last time you speak to me as your wife. Bruno stood still. Margaret glared at him with fury. Are you going to let this woman humiliate me like this? Bruno looked like a child caught between two forces that were impossible to face. But when he saw more guests leaving, his mother let out a huff and walked away with forced dignity. The house fell silent. Bruno looked at Violetta as if he still didn't understand what had just happened. But she already knew. Her marriage had ended at that exact moment. No shouting, no hitting, just an undeniable truth. Bruno had never chosen her. And now, she was finally choosing herself. Violetta slammed the door shut with a sharp thud. The echo reverberated through the house, dispersing the murmur of the last guests who were still walking down the hallway. Her hands were still shaking, her breath was shallow, and her heart was pounding in her chest with fury. She stood there for a few seconds, her back to the door, eyes closed, feeling the tension building in every muscle of her body. Misha and Dima watched her in silence from the couch. They didn't ask anything, but their eyes were filled with confusion, fear, and the feeling that something irreversible had happened. Violetta took a deep breath and forced herself to smile at them, though the smile felt like a fragile mask on her tired face. Come here, she said softly. The kids ran to her and snuggled next to her as she sat on the couch. Violetta hugged them tightly, feeling their small bodies pressed against hers, as if she could still protect them from everything beyond her control. Listen carefully, she whispered. No one will ever make us feel like we don't belong in this home again. Misha buried his face in her chest, nodding silently. Dima looked up at her with his big, curious eyes. And what about Dad? He asked quietly. Violetta closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't want them to carry her resentment, but she couldn't lie to them either. Dad will make his own decisions, she replied. But you and I are a family, and we will always be together. Dima seemed to accept the answer. He hugged her tighter, and the three of them stayed like that for several minutes, in a silence filled with emotions that neither child could express in words. Bruno appeared at the doorway a short while later. His face was a mixture of exhaustion, guilt, and something more difficult to decipher. Violetta. His voice was muffled, almost cautious. She didn't respond immediately. She kept hugging her children, gently stroking their hair. Then, without looking up, she said firmly, "Take them to their room. We'll talk later." Bruno hesitated but obeyed. When he returned to the living room, Violetta was already standing, arms crossed, staring at him like a stranger. "What did you want to say to me?" she asked coldly. Bruno ran a hand through his hair, nervous. "I didn't want it to end like this." Violetta felt the anger bubbling inside her. "Like this?" she repeated. "After what you did? After you kicked me out of my own house?" Bruno rubbed his face, frustrated. "I didn't kick you out. I was just trying to avoid a bigger conflict. The only conflict here is that you were never able to defend me." Her voice trembled slightly. "Never. And the worst part is, it's not that you didn't see it, Bruno. You saw everything. You just chose to do nothing." Bruno opened his mouth but found no words. "I told you I want a divorce," she said suddenly, without hesitation. Bruno turned pale. "Don't say that." "I mean it, completely." Her tone was relentless. "There's no turning back." Bruno seemed like he wanted to argue, but something in Violetta's gaze told him it didn't make sense. His wife wasn't angry. She was determined. And that certainty hit him harder than any shout. "If that's what you want," he murmured. Violetta looked at him steadily. "No, Bruno. It's what I need." The days passed in tense silence. Bruno had agreed to sleep on the couch, though he spent more and more time away from the house. Violetta focused on the kids and her work, avoiding any conversation that wasn't strictly necessary. Their relationship was no longer that of a couple. They were two strangers sharing space. One afternoon, while she was trying to clean up the house after the chaos left by the party, she found something she didn't immediately recognize. It was a thick, yellowed envelope, faded ink spelling out the name, Sergio Ramirez. Violetta furrowed her brow. She didn't know anyone by that name. She turned the paper between her hands and noticed that it smelled old, as if it had been stored away for decades. She felt a pang in her stomach before opening it. Inside were several black and white photographs. Some showed Margaret much younger, but her expression was no different from the one Violetta knew, cold, calculating, with that stiff smile that never reached her eyes. But what caught her attention was the boy standing next to her. It wasn't Bruno. The boy was about 5 years old, with dark hair and huge eyes full of something that seemed like confusion or fear. In some photos, the smile on his face was forced, as if he didn't quite belong in the scene. In others, he simply stared at the camera with a lost expression. Violetta felt a chill run down her body. Among the papers, she found a crumpled, yellowed newspaper clipping. She unfolded it with trembling hands, and her eyes met a headline that took her breath away. 5-year-old boy mysteriously disappears in 1982. The clipping detailed the disappearance of a boy named Sergio Ramirez. He had gotten lost in a park while playing with other children. His parents searched tirelessly, but there were never any solid leads on his whereabouts. Violetta felt her breathing become erratic. Who was that boy? Why did Margaret have pictures with him? She grabbed her phone and dialed Natasha's number. "I need to see you," she said without any explanations. Natasha arrived half an hour later. Violetta showed her the photos and the clipping. Her friend frowned. "This is really strange. Who is this boy?" "I don't know," admitted Violetta, "but I'm going to find out." Natasha took the clipping and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to search through digital archives from that time. Maybe there's more information." The following days were a mix of anxiety and obsession. Violetta couldn't stop looking at those photos. There was something in the way Margaret held the boy, in the way she looked at him in some of the pictures, that churned her stomach. The message from Natasha came after several nights of searching. "I found something. Let's meet." Violetta arrived at the cafe where they'd agreed to meet. Natasha was already there, with her laptop open. "This is what I found," she said bluntly. Sergio Ramirez didn't disappear by accident. His biological mother put him up for adoption. Violetta felt a chill. "Why?" Natasha lowered her voice. "Because he was born with a rare disease. Something related to his immune system. His mother didn't want to take care of him." Violetta swallowed hard. "And Margaret?" Natasha turned the laptop screen around. She showed an old adoption document. Margaret adopted him. Violetta felt her heart race. "And what happened to him?" Natasha took a deep breath. "He was adopted again. Margaret left him when she found out about his illness." Violetta's stomach twisted. "Oh my God." "But there's more," Natasha continued. Shortly after, Margaret adopted another child. His original name isn't in the records, but after the adoption, she gave him a new name. Natasha paused before continuing. "That boy was Bruno." Violetta felt everything in her head spinning. Bruno wasn't Margaret's biological son. Bruno had been adopted because she didn't want to be alone. And before him, there had been another boy. A boy Margaret had discarded as if he meant nothing. The puzzle pieces finally clicked into place. Margaret wasn't just cruel. She was monstrous. The weight of the revelation still hung over Violetta like a thick fog. Ever since she discovered the truth about Margaret and her dark past, she hadn't been able to sleep. Every night, the images of those old photographs appeared in her mind like an echo of the past, a past Margaret had buried with lies and manipulations. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not after knowing what she had done. The morning dawned gray, and the house was silent. Bruno hadn't slept there in the past few days. Since Violetta confronted him with the truth about his adoption, he had stayed silent, shaking his head as if her words were too heavy to be true. Then, without saying anything, he took his jacket and left. Misha and Dima were peacefully sleeping in their room. Violetta stood for a moment watching them, making sure their breathing was soft and regular. She had to protect them. She quickly dressed, grabbed her purse, and left the house. The address was written on the adoption document Natasha had found. A retirement home on the outskirts of the city. According to the information they had tracked down, Sergio Ramirez's biological mother was still alive. When she arrived at the place, she felt a knot in her stomach. The building was old, with peeling walls and an overgrown front garden. As she entered, the smell of disinfectant and reheated food surrounded her. "Can I help you with something?" asked a nurse, looking up from the counter. "I'm looking for Elena Ramirez." The woman looked at her cautiously before nodding. "Come with me." The nurse led her down a hallway to a small common room. Several elderly people were sitting in worn chairs, some watching a cooking show on the TV, others sitting quietly, simply letting time pass. "There she is." The nurse pointed to a woman with completely white hair, her skin lined with deep wrinkles, and her eyes lost in a blank spot on the wall. Violetta approached cautiously. "Mrs. Ramirez." The woman's eyes focused on her. They were dark, sunken, as if time had taken them away. "Yes." Violetta felt her hands trembling. "I'm Violetta. I need to talk to you about your son, Sergio." The elderly woman blinked slowly, and for a moment, confusion seemed to slip across her face. "My son. I know you gave him up for adoption," Violetta said in the softest tone she could find. "I know you left him with a woman named Margaret." Elena's face hardened. "Why do you want to know this?" "Because I think she did something to him." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "She abandoned him." Violetta felt a shiver run down her spine. "She abandoned him?" "They took him away because I was sick," Elena whispered. "They told me the best thing would be for someone who could care for him to adopt him. But that woman..." Her voice trembled. "What happened to him?" The old woman took a while to respond, as if each word cost her a piece of her soul. "After I adopted him, I tried to find him to see if he was okay. But they wouldn't let me see him. And a year later, they told me he wasn't with her anymore. That she had left him somewhere else with another family." Violetta's body tensed. "Where?" Elena shook her head. "They never told me." Violetta's stomach tightened. "Mrs. Ramirez, your son disappeared in 1982. Elena stared at her. "Disappeared?" He was never adopted by anyone else. There are no records of him anywhere else. Tears rolled down the old woman's face. I knew it. Her voice was barely a choked whisper. I always knew that woman did something to him. Violetta felt a chill run down her spine. I can't prove it, Elena said in a broken voice. But she never wanted him. The words hung in the air. Violetta clenched her fists. Margaret hadn't just abandoned that child. Margaret had made sure no one would ever find him. When she left the retirement home, her head was full of thoughts, pieces of a puzzle that still didn't quite fit together. She took her phone and called Natasha. I need to find more information. I'll help you, her friend responded. But, Violetta, be careful. The warning echoed in her mind. That night, while she was going over the documents again at home, a noise made her stop. Footsteps on the ground floor. She stood up, her heart racing. She slowly went down the stairs, feeling the weight of the darkness in the house. When she reached the living room, she saw her. Margaret was standing by the dining table, going through the papers Violetta had left there. What are you doing here? Her voice came out sharp. Margaret looked up, her expression as impassive as ever. I came to see you, dear. You're not welcome here. Margaret let out a low laugh. Oh, Violetta. Always with that dramatic attitude. Violetta walked closer, her eyes burning with rage. You know what I discovered. Margaret tilted her head. And what exactly did you discover? That you abandoned that child. A flash crossed the woman's face. Don't tell me you've come to judge me. Violetta felt her chest rise and fall with contained fury. Where is he? Margaret looked at her fixedly. I have no idea what happened to him. Violetta knew she was lying. He disappeared. And you're the last person who was with him. Margaret smiled. That doesn't prove anything. Violetta felt nauseous. Why did you adopt Bruno? Margaret's eyes darkened. Because I was alone. The words sounded cold, calculated. Violetta felt the fury boiling inside her. You didn't want a child. You just wanted something to fill your emptiness. Margaret smiled with that smile Violetta hated so much. And it worked, didn't it? Violetta felt her hands trembling with rage. You're a monster. Margaret took a step toward her. Be careful what you say, darling. You're going to pay for what you did. Margaret let out a low chuckle. You have no proof. Violetta stared at her with fiery eyes. I'll find it. The air between them grew heavy, suffocating. Margaret looked at her with a cold smile before turning to the door. Good luck with that. When the door closed behind her, Violetta felt her legs tremble. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to let Margaret keep hiding her truth. She was going to find it all out. And Margaret wouldn't be able to stop her. The night felt darker after Margaret's visit. Violetta couldn't get out of her head the coldness with which the woman had responded, her utter indifference to what she had done. Being so calculating, she had left no obvious traces of her crime, but Violetta knew there was more, something hidden that could bring her down. She sat at the table with papers scattered in front of her. The silence of the house was only interrupted by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. She couldn't let this go, not after everything she had discovered. She dialed Natasha's number. Do you know what she did? She whispered as soon as her friend answered. Did you talk to her? Yes. She didn't deny anything, but she didn't admit anything concrete either. She's just waiting for me to get tired and let it go. Natasha sighed on the other end of the line. You're not going to do that, are you? I can't. Violetta closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. I need to know what really happened with Sergio. I'll keep searching for records, Natasha replied. But if he was never registered with another family, if he disappeared after being with her, then... The words hung in the air. Violetta shuddered. I will find the truth. I'll help you. But be careful. Margaret is not an ordinary woman. The call ended, and Violetta stayed staring at the shadows cast by the papers on the table. Margaret hadn't adopted Bruno just because she was alone. She did it to fill the void left by Sergio. And that certainly churned her stomach. The next morning, Violetta headed to the civil registry office. She had tracked down the exact date of Sergio's adoption, and although the law protected certain information, there was something that couldn't be erased: the birth and death records. If Sergio had died, there should be a record. The clerk looked at her tiredly as she explained what she was looking for. Any relation to the child? No. But his biological mother is looking for information. The woman raised an eyebrow but asked no more questions. She typed on the computer, searching for Sergio Ramirez's name in the database. Here it is, she said after a few seconds. Born in 1977, adopted in 1982 by a woman named Margaret Sokoloff. Violetta's heart raced. Is there any record after that? The woman frowned at the screen. Nothing. Nothing? There is no record of him being adopted by another family. There is no school registered under his name after that date. There is nothing. Violetta felt the knot in her stomach tighten. And the death record? The clerk typed again. There is no death certificate. A chill ran through her body. So, it's as if he ceased to exist. Violetta swallowed hard. Thank you. She left the office feeling the air grow heavier. Margaret hadn't left him with another family. Margaret had made him disappear. The impulse to run and confront her was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to stop. She had no concrete proof, just pieces of a puzzle that still hadn't fully come together. She needed a key piece. Something that would expose Margaret once and for all. And then she remembered. The house where Margaret lived in the 80s. If there were answers, they had to be there. The address was written in the adoption documents she had found with Natasha. It was an old house located on the outskirts of the city. She had no idea who lived there now, but if there was anything that could help her, she would find it. She drove to the location with her heart pounding. The road was lined with trees, and the house appeared through the greenery like a shadow from the past. It was a 2-story structure with chipped paint and windows covered in dust. It looked abandoned. Violetta parked the car at a safe distance and got out cautiously. She walked up to the front door and knocked with her knuckles. Silence. She knocked again. Nothing. She took a deep breath and walked around the house. If the house was vacant, maybe no one had cleaned it in years. Maybe there were still traces of what had happened there. She stopped in the backyard. The weeds had grown between the cracked tiles, and an old tool shed leaned in a corner of the yard. She moved forward with slow steps, feeling every fiber of her body screaming for her to stop. But she couldn't. She placed her hand on the shed door and pushed it gently. It creaked open. Dust rose into the air. The inside was filled with old boxes, rusty tools, and a strong smell of dampness. She checked the shelves with trembling hands. And then she saw it. A small children's shoe. Old, covered in dust. Violetta's stomach churned. She grabbed the shoe with her trembling hands and examined it. It was too small. And it was alone. Her breathing became uneven. Something moved at the shed door. Fear paralyzed her for a second. She slowly turned her head. And there it was. Margaret. Standing with a dark gaze and an empty expression. You shouldn't be here, she said in a chilling voice. Violetta felt her heart race. What did you do to him? Margaret tilted her head. You have no idea what you're doing. Tell me. Margaret smiled. Some truths should never be discovered. Violetta squeezed the shoe in her hand. I will discover everything. Margaret took a step closer. You won't. The air became suffocating. Violetta felt the threat in every word. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. Time seemed to stop inside the shed. Violetta held the small children's shoe in her hands, her chest rising and falling with a mix of fear and determination. In front of her, Margaret remained still, her gaze dark and sharp like a knife. You won't do it, Margaret repeated in a cold, almost mechanical tone. Violetta felt her body tense, but she didn't lower her gaze. I'm going to find out the truth. Margaret let out a low, emotionless laugh. You don't know what you're saying. You have no idea what really happened. Violetta clenched her fists. Then tell me. Margaret moved forward slowly, her heels echoing against the rotting wood of the floor. That child should have never been born. The words hit her like a slap. What? Margaret sighed, crossing her arms. It was a mistake. His mother abandoned him because she couldn't handle him. He was fragile, sickly. He was never going to survive for long. I just did what I had to do. Violetta felt a chill run down her skin. What did you do with him? Margaret smiled slightly, as if the answer was obvious. I returned him to the place where he should never have left. Violetta's stomach twisted. Did you kill him? Margaret shrugged. Don't be dramatic. I just left him in a place where he couldn't bother anyone else. Violetta's hands started to shake. You're a monster. Margaret tilted her head. I'm practical. Violetta felt an urge to run, to get away from this woman, but something inside her refused to do it. Where's his body? Margaret looked at her with an expression that almost seemed bored. You won't find it. Violetta felt her anger boil inside her. I'm not going to let you get away with this. Margaret took another step closer. And tell me, dear, how do you plan to stop me? With an old shoe? You have no proof. You have nothing. Violetta swallowed hard. Maybe not now, but I'll find it. Margaret stayed silent for a long moment. Then, her smile disappeared. I'll give you some advice, Violetta. Let this go. It's the best thing for you and your children. Violetta felt a shiver at the implied threat in her words. You don't scare me. Margaret smiled again. We'll see. She turned on her heels and left the shed, leaving Violetta alone with her discovery and the feeling that she had unearthed something much darker than she ever imagined. That night, Violetta couldn't sleep. Margaret's words echoed in her head. I returned him to the place where he should never have left. The shoe was still on the kitchen table, along with the adoption papers and the newspaper clipping about Sergio's disappearance. She picked up her phone and called Natasha. I'm scared. What happened? Margaret knows I'm investigating. And she doesn't care. She doesn't bother to hide it. Natasha sighed on the other end of the line. That means she's confident. She thinks you can't do anything against her. But I can. Violetta took a deep breath. I'm going to the police. Natasha was silent for a moment. Do you have enough evidence? Violetta looked at the shoe on the table. No, but I have her confession. Did you record it? Violetta stayed silent. Natasha let out a sigh. I knew I should have gotten you a recorder. I don't need a recorded confession to make them investigate. I know, but be careful. Margaret isn't stupid. Violetta said goodbye and hung up. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't just stand by. She grabbed her keys and left the house. The police station was dimly lit when she arrived. A tired-looking officer glanced at her from the counter. How can I help you? Violetta swallowed hard. I want to file a report. The officer raised an eyebrow. About what? Violetta took a deep breath. A murder. The officer blinked. Explain. Violetta told him everything. From Sergio's adoption to his disappearance. From Margaret's coldness to her sinister words. The officer listened with a furrowed brow. This is very serious. Do you have evidence? Violetta felt fear creeping in, but she forced herself to stay strong. I have enough reason for them to investigate. The officer nodded slowly. We'll open a case. Violetta felt the air return to her lungs. The days passed with unbearable tension. Bruno showed up at the house in the early hours. He looked pale, gaunt, as if he had been wandering aimlessly. Violetta. She looked at him without saying a word. Bruno ran his hand across his face. I went to see her. Violetta felt a shiver. Who? Margaret. She held her breath. And what happened? Bruno dropped into a chair. I asked her if it was true. If I was just a replacement. Violetta felt a pang of pity, but said nothing. Bruno lifted his head. She didn't deny it. Violetta felt the rage rise in her chest. Of course she didn't. Bruno put his hands to his face. How did I not see it before? Violetta crossed her arms. Because you didn't want to see it. Bruno let out a broken sigh. What are you going to do? Violetta didn't hesitate. I'm going to make sure she pays for what she did. Bruno looked at her with clouded eyes. I want to help you. Violetta felt her heart tighten. I don't know if you can. Bruno swallowed hard. I'll try. The police opened an investigation. They searched records, interviewed people who knew Margaret in the 80s. There was no body, but the inconsistencies in her story made the authorities start to pressure her. Margaret tried to remain unshaken, but something in her posture began to change. A month later, the news broke. In an empty lot near Margaret's old house, tracking dogs found human remains. DNA tests confirmed what Violetta already knew. Sergio Ramirez had never been adopted by another family. He had died at Margaret's hands. The trial was long and painful, but in the end, the truth came to light. Margaret was convicted. Bruno never fully recovered, but he walked away from his mother forever. Violetta finally felt she could breathe. When the trial ended, she took her children to the park. She sat on a bench as she watched them play. The sun shone over them. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Margaret's shadow had faded away, and life, finally, could go on. What an emotional ending! I'm glad you made it this far. Stories like this show the human capacity to overcome adversity and find the strength to move forward, even in the most difficult circumstances. If you were in a similar situation, facing betrayals and such huge challenges, how would you handle it? What decisions would you make to protect your loved ones and rebuild your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know how you would approach such a complex challenge and what you think about the development of this story. Also, if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing more exciting and thoughtful stories like this. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. Don't miss the next narrative coming up on your screen. We have many captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment especially for you. See you in the next video. A hug.